So I think a lot of people watching this, Gordon, and actually this goes back to a question that a colleague here working in the Porters Lodge this evening, who asked me not to name him, but asked me to put to you, which is a bit like the person at the Martin Luther King speech. Where was this, Gordon? When you were Prime Minister, why was it so hard to get this message across, which I think is, compelling and it resonates. What made it harder to be heard as Prime Minister?
Because we were dealing in the shadow of the Iraq War, we were dealing with people worried about taxation, we were dealing with perhaps a tiredness that people thought after 10, 11, 12 years of a Labour government. But also, during the financial crisis, and you will remember this, Tom, because you were working closely with us then, I kept asking myself, how do I get the message across to the country? What we were saying was, the private sector has actually failed here. The banks cannot solve this problem on their own. Governments have got to intervene. But if we're to protect jobs and stop people's mortgages being repossessed and stop businesses going under, we have to spend money. So we will run a deficit, and it will mean that there is debt. And it's an essential element of recovery, because if you have growth, then the deficit will come down as tax revenues come in. Now, how do I get this message across to the public that what we are doing is not spending in a profligate way? We are actually doing the only thing that, as we've seen in this crisis, a sensible government can do, which is to make sure that when the private sector can't do it, you actually step in and make sure that things happen. And I kept saying to myself, how do I get this message across? And I did a few public meetings. But, in the 1930s, when Roosevelt had this terrible sort of depression in America, he did radio talks. And that's what captivated people, fireside chats, they call them. But who would have listened to a radio chat? Or if you decided it wasn't radio, it was television. He was doing it on a Saturday night. Who would have listened to me talking on a Saturday night up against Strictly Come Dancing? And when it came to Twitter and all that, they were not at that stage sufficiently advanced that you could actually have the instant appeal. And I was very slow to understand the power of social media. So I kept asking myself, how do you get your message across in this modern democracy where the means of communication are not really ones that are suited for political messages at all? And so I would love to have gone around the country and spoken at meetings and mass meetings to explain what I was trying to do. But somehow I probably made a mistake, concentrated on getting the crisis sorted, and I think we did, but at the expense of getting my message across, which I think we didn't. And therefore, I don't think I'm a different person. I don't think I've suddenly changed. I'm maybe a bit older, maybe a bit wiser, because you learn, of course, certainly you've got plenty of time to learn from your mistakes. But I do think politics lacks the vehicles that we had previously that are resonant for individual citizens. And you tell me how to get your message across, because it is incredibly difficult. Now, President Trump did it, but he did it in such an aggressive way through social media that I don't think anybody would want that to happen in Britain.
Yeah. Well, maybe the answer was, as Ed Balls discovered, to actually just go and compete in Strictly Come Dancing anyway and get it.
I don't think I would have done so well on that. I mean, my best is getting onto Football Focus and talking about sport. I don't think I could have done the dancing or the singing or the baking, which he's now doing, Ed Balls.
Good. I think that's a relief all around. So a question actually related to this, Gordon, from Professor Pat Roach, who's an astrophysicist, who says, how do we recover from the loss of trust, honesty and integrity? You touched on Iraq, but I think Pat's also looking more recently, it's blighted US and UK in recent years. In Italy, Pat says, there's deep skepticism of political directions and interventions. How do we start to rebuild confidence in politics and politicians?
Yeah, I think what we've got is, if you like, culture wars, and I think we've seen it on so many different occasions in recent weeks and months, where what seems a relatively small issue, whether the Queen's photograph is up in one of your colleges in Oxford, or whether a statue is up, or whether a painting or something in the British Museum is actually to continue to be there because of race, slavery or other causes of it being there in the first place in the past. And these descend into culture wars, and it suits some people to say that is the defining issue of our times. And of course, when you think about it, getting people fed, getting people jobs, getting people vaccinated, getting a decent health service, decent school system, decent universities and everything, these are the issues that worry people. And suddenly they're being told that the most important issue is whether a painting or whether a statue is up there. And we tend to allow ourselves, partly because of the social media is basically a shouting match without an umpire. I mean, basically, you've got extremes fighting each other on social media, and then that's replicated in the culture wars. And we've got to say we cannot allow ourselves to be, if you like, captured by and submerged in culture wars. We've got to see the bigger picture, that these are not the real issues. Poverty is an issue, deprivation is an issue, ignorance is an issue, squalor is an issue, pollution is an issue, war and conflict are issues. But the issues that we tend to see the front pages of our newspapers focusing on are not the real issues. And we've got to find a way of saying, look, let's get to the crucial issues. And then you can start to rebuild trust. I mean, no politician will get everything right. No politician will do anything other than make many mistakes, because these are difficult judgments, especially in a time like this. But if you can rebuild trust by people seeing that you're not trying to divert from the issue, you're actually facing the issue, then I think people can be persuaded that politics is, if you like, in some sense rehabilitated and is worth, it is about public service in the end. It's not about people presenting themselves as heroes or idols or celebrities. It's about changing the world through people serving the public.
I just relate to that. So Charlie Hancock says that she heard you on the podcast with Christian Gary Murphy, who is, by the way, studied here at Hertford.
He got a good education.
So he had a good start in life. And you were talking about culture wars as a distraction. So the question is, so what are they distracting young people from? Of all these issues that you're looking at in the book, you might not be surprised that we here are most excited about climate change, poverty, education. Are there any of those issues that you think aren't cutting through to this generation that we should worry more about?
I think peace and war, actually. I think nuclear weapons. I mean, if I were to wake up in the morning and think when I was Prime Minister, what was one of the gravest problems we still face? There is still a sword of Damocles, as John Kennedy talked about, hanging over us. I mean, we have got 9 nuclear weapon states. We've got other states wanting to be nuclear weapon states. We've got the potential to destroy ourselves in one go. As Kennedy said, if we don't abolish nuclear weapons, they will abolish us. And yet there's been very, very little progress over the last 30 years. I studied what happened between Reagan and Gorbachev. And, Reagan was a very, right-wing, anti-communist figure. When Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister, wanted to meet him, and he refused and kept refusing, and then eventually met him, Reagan said to people about Olof Palme, he was a Social Democrat Prime Minister, isn't he a communist? And his staff said, no, Mr. President, he's an anti-communist. And Reagan said, I don't care what kind of communist he is. And this was a Reagan anti-communist, but he eventually came to an agreement with Gorbachev. And apparently they were meeting in Switzerland before the Reykjavik summit that in a sense, brought to an end the arms race for the time being. And Reagan, who was interested in Star Wars and all that sort of thing, and he said to Gorbachev, if an asteroid came to the Earth, would you help us and attacked America? Would you help us? And Gorbachev said, of course we would. And Reagan said, we too, we'd help you. And the bond was made, and they got a settlement on weapons. But 30 years on, we had an international space station where Russian and American astronauts are up there together, still above us. But the tensions are still great, and nuclear weapon proliferation is happening. Weapons are more sophisticated. Some of the old agreements are broken down, and there's not the sort of understanding that could prevent misrepresentation and misunderstandings happening. We've got a new entrant in a big way, which is China, and we've got Korea, Iran, and we've got the possibility of an arms race in the Middle East. I think we've got to think about how we can de-escalate this. And I still hold to the view that if we could ban nuclear tests, if we could end the production of plutonium and uranium, which I think is possible, and if countries would commit and say that they would not be the first to use nuclear weapons, and unless people use nuclear weapons against them, they would never use nuclear weapons, I think we could get to a sensible solution that would downgrade the role of nuclear weapons and eventually eliminate them. I think we've got to give that some attention, because it's an outstanding issue about our security that people really don't talk about now, but it's still a big problem.
Quick question on poverty and refugees, and coming back really to your wider work on education. This is from Petros, who's a professor of biochemistry here. He's picking up on the comments you made about Lesbos and the support to refugees there. He's saying, but it's a political decision by the EU forming these camps to keep refugees away from Europe. Do you think we should change that?
I've always believed that if the European Union had been more generous in the initial stages and helped refugees temporarily place themselves in Lebanon, Jordan, and in Turkey, then a lot of the pressure to leave the country and go to Europe would not have happened. Now, if you were in Lebanon, so you know that there were, I think, 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And Lebanon, despite all its difficulties, did quite a lot to help these refugees. But when it came to Turkey and Jordan, the money was not there to do what was needed, so people left. People remember this story perhaps of Alan Kurdi, who was this young refugee boy in this red t-shirt who was washed up on the Mediterranean, and this 4-year-old died because his boat capsized as his family tried to take him from Turkey across into Europe. And they paid a lot of money for this, but the boat was ramshackle and it collapsed, and he died within a few minutes of being on that boat. And we saw these photographs all over the world. But what people didn't know was that the family was trying to get him out of the country because they thought it was the only chance of getting him an education. He couldn't get one in Syria, he couldn't get one in Turkey, thought the only way is to come to Europe. In fact, he was wanting to go to Canada, the father, and it ended up in this tragedy, paying money simply because they couldn't get an education for their child in the vicinity of Syria. And we should have done more. And I think that was the first mistake that was made. And then, of course, what we've seen in Europe, unfortunately, is this populist nationalism. The resistance to immigrants is happening even in countries where there are hardly any immigrants. And Hungary is a very good example, I'm afraid, where you've got this popular frenzy whipped up by the Prime Minister Orban against immigration, even though only 6% of Hungary's population have been born outside Hungary. And as someone said, there are more anti-immigrant parties in Hungary today than there are immigrants. It's as bad as that. And he whipped up. So that poster, remember that poster in the British referendum, Breaking Point, the one that Nigel Farage put up with all the what he portrayed as Muslim hordes trying to get into Britain and walking with no women and no children. They were all blanked out. The photograph was only of bearded men trying to come into what he said was Britain, although it was actually a photograph taken elsewhere. Now that poster, Breaking Point, then reappeared in Hungary under the heading Stop. The same poster, the same anti-immigrant, the same xenophobic propaganda. And really, Europe, I'm afraid, has fallen for this populist nationalism. And we've really got to take it head on and say, look, you can be patriots, but you don't need to present the world as a struggle between us and them at every point, where you've got to actually win in some sort of zero-sum game where everybody else has got to lose so that you can win.
So since you mentioned Europe, I know you want to talk about changing the world, but closer to home, this is a question. You will recognize the fingerprints of my predecessor, Will Hutton, on this one, but also Tyril Rahn, who is a master's student here from Norway and the president of the Oxford Diplomacy Society. You're a rejoiner. You've come out as a rejoiner now. How are you going to reconcile that with the electoral reality in the UK?
I've said that I didn't want to leave and I would like to be back in Europe. I've not said that I'm able to persuade either the Labour Party or other parties that they're going to do this overnight. I think what we've got to concentrate on in the meantime, and Norway knows all about this because Norway has voted to stay out of the European Union, but has a good relationship with the Union. I think we've got to think about how, instead of it becoming a punch bag, I'm anti-Europe to be pro-British, and so it's always Britain versus Europe instead of Britain and Europe. We've got to find some relationship, and that includes Ireland, of course. We've got to find some relationship where Europe and the United Kingdom can work better together. And if you have a referendum in the heat of that, people say things and people promise to do things, but really there is no future for Britain if there is not a constructive relationship with the rest of Europe. And while I want to rejoin, I accept that that's not possible in the short term, but I do think we should build a strong, constructive and positive relationship with Europe. And we could cooperate on things like Erasmus, which is the training of young people, and scientific cooperation by extending Horizon. We can do it on infrastructure with the European Investment Bank. And gradually, I think we can build a far more positive relationship with Europe, as we should do coming up to COP26 on climate change, because we and the European Union are absolutely crucial to getting an agreement on climate change.
And all these challenges, you described a world where the international system can't cope, needs fixing, national leadership is lacking, we need more individual engagement and agency. Is there a role, I mean, sorry to be parochial in all this, but is there a role for universities? What would you like to see places like Oxford doing better?
I think we need to show that we can cooperate better with other countries and other institutions. I mean, I would like students to be linked up to universities in Africa and Asia. I would like to see universities themselves in far more cooperative relationships with other institutions in other countries. I know this happens, but I think we can extend it. When you think of the challenge of education in the future, it's not only going to be multidisciplinary. In fact, you need lots of skills, the skills to communicate, to collaborate, and all these sort of things that demand contact and connection and communication. But also, I think we need to find ways to work together to solve common research problems that we've got in to deal with, and also, of course, simply transfers of students so that people understand each other. I mean, I was involved in creating the Mandela Scholarship in Africa, which is for students from Africa to be able to study at other universities in other countries. We don't have we've got the Fulbright, and we've got the Kennedy, and we've got all these other scholarships. I was talking earlier to you, Tom, I think we need a refugee scholarship. I think we need to be able to bring refugees to universities in Britain and elsewhere and find a way of paying for them. And we need to benefit from the fact that this is an interdependent world, that societies that once were homogeneous are now far more heterogeneous, that London is one of the most international cities in the world. And obviously, your university is one that has students from every country in the world. And I think we've got to build on that by building greater and stronger connections for the future.
And with apologies for being controversial, but an intervention once in the distant past on Oxford has excited some of our questioners.
Yeah.
Do you think we're doing better on access than when you criticised Oxford? I can't remember how many, but when you were Chancellor.
Yes, look, I felt very concerned about the very high proportion of pupils from state schools that didn't get into Oxford and Cambridge, and also the very high number that were capable of applying and didn't feel that the university was for them. So I admire Oxford and Cambridge as institutions. I wanted to see them have a wider base, if you like, to build from. And in any society, it's the widest possible base of talent you've got to build from to get the best students and the best educated people. Look, I worry, and I think Oxford is doing a lot better, and your college particularly, but I worry about a world that is now divided between the education rich and the education poor. And in one of the chapters in the book, 7 Ways to Change the World, I talk about this new divide. So it's not just rich poor, it's education rich and education poor. And this divide is actually growing between the education rich, who can command high salaries, and rightly so because of their abilities and their talents. They've got to be properly rewarded because of the merit and the work they've done. But the huge gap between the education rich and the education poor. Now, that was not as true after the Second World War as it is now. And I do worry about the divisions that then grow in your society and the lack of cohesion that exists because you've got one group that is doing well and another group that feels left behind. And a lot of the populist nationalism that we're seeing around the world is people who feel that they're left behind, they're not listened to, they're not consulted, they're not taken into account, they're treated in many ways as second-class citizens. So I think we've got to be aware that this is a 75-25% world that I talk about in the book. 75% now who do not have qualifications from education, who, even now, half the world's school children leave school without any qualifications that are worthy of anything in the workplace. But in total, once you include adults, it's 75% of the world that's unqualified, if you like, as against the 25% who are or will be in the next 10 or 20 years. And unless we do something to extend educational opportunity across the world, and I'm thinking particularly of the poorest countries of the world, where, large numbers of people, never get education beyond 10. And of course, there's still 280, 260 million, probably more than that, 300 million children now who don't go to school at all, even although they're school-age children. We've got to do something about that.
I can't believe it, but somehow we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask one last quick question, which comes from Niall Shaban, which is how dangerous or helpful to all these challenges is social media? I noticed, Gordon, you've recently joined Twitter.
My wife Sarah has been on Twitter for years, and she's got more than 1 million followers. And I've always been embarrassed when I've not actually spent any time trying to build up any audience in Twitter. Look, Twitter has its place, so does Facebook, so does everything else. But I do worry about the way algorithms are used to direct people to particular causes or to particular extreme positions. And I do worry about the lack of proper regulation of social media. I think this is becoming a problem that is going to divide our society even further. So I would like us to have a discussion. I mean, I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anybody really does have all the answers, but I know Tim Berners-Lee very well, and he's been a very good friend of mine, and I do believe he's right to say that it's wrong that your information is held by someone else, and you've got no right to have the information about yourself in the way that you should have. And I do also worry about the way that social media companies go about driving their agenda for both money and for what is controversial. So we end up with a very divided society. I think we've got to think about the consequences of that. So everything that's good about social media, we want to retain, which is the openness, the transparency. Everybody gets the chance to put the views. But everything that is dangerous, I think we've got to look at very, very closely as a society, and you can't have so much control being exercised by such a small group of people in a way that actually colours or polarizes public debate.
Someone once asked me why it was that you weren't a more active user of social media, and I said, well, the problem with Gordon is that in order to write a tweet, he has to write a speech, and in order to write a speech, he has to write a book. And in fact, here we are. You've written the book in order to be able to write the tweets. But in a way, looking back on it, thank goodness that there are people out there who are willing to do the work, to do the substantive thinking before leaping to the soundbite, before leaping to the tweet.
I think the real problem, Tom, is that I'm a two-finger typist, and every time I type something, I make incredible mistakes because my right hand is faster than my left hand. And I used to type my essays at university, and one of my lecturers used to say, "You've finally convinced me that typing can be as illegible as writing." And I think I proved that. And so, and when someone put my emails through the test of Google, it came out as they thought it was probably Danish rather than English. My spelling was so bad, and the letters were all in the wrong place. So I think that's one of the reasons why I haven't focused much on Twitter.
I've kept some of those emails for the British Museum to look at.
You'll not be able to understand them, unfortunately.
Don't worry, they're under lock and key. Gordon, thank you so much. It's perhaps a kind of testimony to the extraordinary answers you've given that I actually have a message in from one of Barack Obama's main advisors who was with us back at that summit that I described at the beginning of the discussion. And he says, Gordon still has a plan. And I think you've shown us all tonight that
I think Barack Obama had a few plans as well. I mean, he created a wonderful change in the American health system, and I think he showed people that change is possible in America. So I should have said that when we were talking about Barack Obama. He did make a huge difference to the way the world works.
So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for the brilliant questions. I'm sorry to the hundreds of people actually that we didn't get to who asked questions. I'm conscious we could go on all night, but that's the end of this session. Thank you to How to Academy for co-hosting it. Thank you to colleagues at Hertford College for getting it all set up. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. And most of all, I think we'd love to give you a virtual standing ovation, Gordon. Thank you for such fantastic answers and for giving us this time this evening. And good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.